I'm going to moderate this panel, Psychology Panel 2. Just as an FYI, before we start, and I told Sifa this, is that we've been having some power cuts here, so if I disappear into the ether for 10 minutes or so, that's why. And if it happens during the question and answer part of the presentation, then we'll see if it will take over. Anyway, first guest speaker is John Eastwood. He's going to present a paper titled Self-Focused but Lacking Self-Insight, the Relationship Between Boredom and Self-Consciousness. John Eastwood is a clinical psychologist and associate professor of clinical psychology at York University, not too far from where I am. He conducts research on the intersection between cognition and emotion. He also trains future clinical psychologists. His research is funded by the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, or NSERC, to those of us who know. His work is currently focused on understanding the feelings of thinking, such as boredom and mental effort, and explores how such feelings play a role in regulating cognition. He is co-author of Out of My Skull, The Psychology of Boredom, published by Harvard University Press last year, 2020. So I'm sure we know what the format is now. You have 50 minutes to talk and 10 minutes question and answer, and I'll let you know when 2 minutes are about to transpire. So go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Up here. Okay, I can't see anybody now. I hope and trust that you're able to see my screen. If not, somebody please let me know verbally. Well, I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you so much to the organizers of the conference for inviting me and for putting together such a wonderful conference. It's great to get together with people around the world and talk to people who think about boredom from different perspectives. Today, I would like to do something a little different. Rather than providing a high-level kind of overview of some of the work that I've been doing, I thought I would sort of bring you into the lab, so to speak, and talk to you about some of the more recent work we've been doing and some of our more recent ideas. And this work has been done together with my graduate student, Veer Paul. And so the title of our talk is Self-Focused but Lacking Self-Knowledge, the relation between boredom and self-perception. So Saturday, June 3rd, 2017 at 5:32 a.m., Alex Honnold began his free solo ascent of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park. Laser focused, he thought of nothing but the next move. All self-awareness evaporated in intense concentration as he executed his carefully rehearsed plan, all the while dangling by his fingertips 3,000 feet from the ground, completely unaided by ropes or fellow climbers. Just under 4 hours later, he arrived at the summit. During his climb, he achieved what psychologists might refer to as a state of flow, where the sense of self dissipates, leaving nothing but skilled, focused doing. In contrast, 2,000 miles away, Joel Underwood sat slumped on his sofa in a cramped San Francisco apartment. The long, empty Saturday morning stretched out in front of him. A day free from work, yet nothing inspired him. His mind unfocused and unable to concentrate, all he could do was dwell on himself and how bored he felt. So what is boredom? We've already talked a little bit about this today, and so I won't dwell on this too much, but I would say I think about boredom as a feeling, as distinct from an emotion proper. I would call boredom a feeling, and specifically, I would say it's the feeling of an unengaged mind. And there are two core things happening in the mind of a bored person. The first we refer to as a desire bind. The bored person desperately wants to be doing something, but doesn't want to do anything in particular. They can't muster up an actionable desire for any of the possibilities available at the moment. This is what Tolstoy referred to when he defined boredom as the desire for desires. Secondly, the bored person is struggling with an unoccupied mind. Their cognitive capacity, their attentional resources are underutilized or lying fallow. This is what Saul Bellows referred to as boredom as the pain of unused powers. And so I would argue that these are the two subpersonal things that are happening in the mind that give rise to the subjective experience of boredom. So when we're bored, we're thrown out of engagement and back onto ourselves. The self becomes salient and problematic. And yet, despite this idea that boredom may involve this intense self-focus, there's actually not a lot of research on this, not a lot of empirical research on the relationship between boredom and self-focus. Seb and Vodanovich in 1998 showed that trait boredom was, on the one hand, positively correlated with self-reflectiveness and negatively correlated with internal state awareness. Ghana showed that trait boredom was positively correlated with introspectiveness. And Harris showed that trait boredom, namely trait boredom refers to the general propensity or tendency to experience boredom, trait boredom was positively correlated with mood monitoring and negatively correlated with mood labeling. In our own lab, we've shown that trait boredom is positively correlated with difficulty identifying and difficulty describing feelings from the alexithymia scale. Finally, Andrew Moynihan, across two studies in 2015 and 2017, showed that trait self-focused attention enhances the impact of boredom both on unhealthy eating and on impulsivity. So how can we sort of make sense of this literature that on the surface might seem a little confusing or perhaps even a little contradictory? First thing I want to just point out is that, psychologists who have talked about self-related terms, there's this proliferation of concepts and words that are used just within psychology, let alone before philosophers and other people get in the game as well. So there's just this proliferation of terms, and people sometimes are using the same word to refer to two different things or using different words to refer to the same thing. And in light of this, Moran in 2017 tried to sort of bring the research world together and to provide a taxonomy of self-related terms to make sure people were using words similarly. And so I've chosen two words or two concepts here from his taxonomy to try to make sense of this past literature. The first concept is self-directed attention. And this refers to a situation where a person is focusing their attention on their own interiority. This might be thoughts, feelings, sensations, as opposed to focusing attention externally. The second concept I'm going to work with is self-knowledge. And I'm going to look at more specifically emotional awareness as a component of self-knowledge. And for Moran, this refers to having an accurate and coherent understanding of, from past research, is that the tendency to direct attention to oneself is distinct from self-knowledge or emotional awareness. We might think that those two things would go hand in hand, but actually it turns out that people who direct attention to themselves have less self-knowledge or less self-awareness. And so that's an important observation that we know outside of the boredom world in the literature on self-focused attention. So based on these ideas, I think we can try to summarize some of these past findings by proposing that perhaps people who have higher levels of self-directed attention and poorer self-knowledge or will be more prone to boredom. And so across three, Paul and I tried to address three research objectives. Our first objective was to create and validate a measure of state self-directed attention. Secondly, we sought to test the hypothesis that state boredom causes state self-directed attention. And third, we wanted to test the hypothesis that trait self-knowledge or emotional awareness, test the hypothesis that trait self-knowledge and trait self-directed attention uniquely contribute to trait boredom. So in order to address our first objective, we generated a large number of self-report items that we thought would get at state self-directed attention. And we went through various iterations of those items, refining them, discarding ones that weren't working well, either psychometrically or we thought they had some face validity problems. And we boiled it down to these 5 items. I'm noticing changes in my mood while doing the activity at hand. I keep thinking about my feelings. I'm focused on my thoughts. My thoughts are on my mind. I'm focusing my attention on my inner self. And we found that these 5 items had a very good fit psychometrically. A 1-factor model was an excellent fit to the data. And you can see some of those statistics here. And that this scale had excellent reliability. Now, the first thing we wanted to do was compare state self-directed attention to state boredom. And so to do that, we first have to show that we can measure state boredom distinctly from state self-directed attention. And so we used a version of our short multidimensional state boredom scale to this end. And here are the items, the 6 items that we used for that here. And again, just to show you that the 6 items for our state boredom scale formed an excellent 1-factor model with good reliability and excellent psychometric properties. And what we showed here is that indeed we're able to measure state self-directed attention distinctly from state boredom. So a 2-factor model was a good fit to the data. A 2-factor model showing that there are 2 distinct but correlated concepts. Now, importantly, the 2-factor model fit significantly better than a 1-factor model. And so that leaves us with some confidence that we were able to measure state self-directed attention distinctly from state boredom. We also wanted to validate our measure of state self-directed attention by showing that scores on this measure are correlated in expected ways with various trait measures. And so indeed, you can see that trait introspection, mood monitoring, private self-consciousness, and reflection all predict levels of state self-directed attention as one would expect. The next thing we wanted to do to establish the validity of our scale was to bring people into the lab. And half of the people, we asked them to undergo a self-novelty manipulation where they were asked to think about and then write about what makes them different from their family members, friends, and other people. And another group of people were asked to describe the features of an external environment, such as a gas station. And this is a well-established procedure in the literature for manipulating self-focused attention. And so then we measured state self-directed attention after this manipulation to check to see whether or not our new scale was sensitive to variations in self-directed attention. And indeed, it was. So we found that people who underwent the self-focused attention manipulation scored higher on our measure of state self-directed attention compared to those that were in the externally oriented condition. And this is true after controlling for state affect and pre-manipulation levels of self-focused attention. So with respect to objective 1, my summary here is that we were able to develop a measure of state self-focused attention that has good psychometric properties, is distinct from and yet correlated with state boredom, and that demonstrates good validity. So then we were able to move on to our second objective, which was to test this idea that state boredom actually causes an enhanced level of state self-directed attention. So again, here we brought people into the lab, and half of the people underwent a boredom manipulation where they watched a video about a person talking about their job at an office supply company. And another group of people watched an entertaining portion of an entertaining comedy. And then we measured their levels of state self-directed attention after the manipulation. And indeed, we found evidence that boredom causes an increase in state self-directed attention. So those that went through the boredom manipulation were more self-focused after compared to people that went through an entertaining or watched an entertaining video. Just for good measure, we asked the question that is the relationship between boredom and self-directed attention bi-directional? So here we manipulated self-focused attention and then looked at boredom scores and found that boredom scores did not differ after undergoing a self-focused manipulation. So the answer is that no, it does not seem to be a bi-directional relationship. So just to summarize what I've told you so far, the state self-directed attention is a reliable and valid measure. State boredom and state self-directed attention are distinct constructs, and they're positively correlated. Manipulating boredom causes an increase in self-directed attention, but manipulating self-directed attention does not alter state boredom. So then we could go on to look at our third objective, which was to see if state self-directed attention and self-knowledge, or more specifically emotional awareness, if they were able to provide unique predictive ability when it comes to understanding trait boredom. And indeed, you can see from this slide that that is indeed the case. Emotional awareness had a strong negative correlation with trait boredom, and trait self-directed attention had a strong positive relationship to boredom. And we can see here that the three-factor model is an adequate fit to the data. So summary of our findings here for objective 3, a model that specifies 3 distinct but related dispositional constructs of boredom, self-directed attention, and emotional awareness fits the data well, and fits the data significantly better than models that specify less than 3 factors. And self-knowledge, or emotional awareness more specifically, uniquely and negatively predicts trait boredom. Trait self-directed attention uniquely and positively predicts trait boredom. Now, these findings, I just want to discuss these findings a little bit and put them in some context, and then talk about future directions and implications of this. So in terms of discussing the results, I would argue that these findings are consistent with what we know from emotion theory. And I'll look at that from a couple different points of view. So there is some research, for example, looking into different types of emotions. And some people have argued that there are what are referred to as self-referential emotions. So emotions like guilt or shame that involve a self-referential focus. And that these kinds of self-referential emotions involve greater self-focused attention. And so it may be that we should consider thinking about boredom as another exemplar of a self-referential emotion. Alternatively, we also know that there's a lot of research showing that negative emotions involve a greater degree of self-focused attention compared to positive emotions. And so it may simply be that because boredom is a negative emotion, it involves a greater degree of self-focused attention. Another idea from emotion theory, drawing particularly on the work of Frege and Marcel and Lambie, they talk about how in any given episode of emotion, our attention can be directed to different poles in that experience. So if we think about experiencing a dangerous situation, or we consider experiencing fear, if our attention is focused on the external world, what's going to be salient and what we're going to focus on is that sense of danger. If our attention is more focused on the self, then we'll have what will be salient is a sense of vulnerability. And if we're more focused on action, then what's going to be salient is that urge to flee or to fight. And so the idea here is that in any emotional episode or any feeling component of an emotion, that our attention can be focused on these different poles. And so it may be that in the case of boredom, attention is very much focused on the self pole of these three possibilities. And thinking about the intersection between these Venn diagrams here, I think is very important and interesting. So if we think about the intersection between self and action, this very much refers to what are called action tendencies. So during feeling states, an action tendency might refer to that urge or that impetus to act. And that this is one of the ideas that's very central to emotion theory, that emotions organize a response to a perceived environment. And so we know in boredom that there is this ineffectual action tendency, or an absence of an action tendency, or an action tendency that lacks a specific target. This is the desire for desires I spoke about earlier. If we think about the intersection between action and world, this kind of refers to what is called affordances. So we know that the world, this is based on the research of Gibson, the idea that the world affords certain actions. You know, a puddle is perceived as a puddle that I can jump over, or a puddle that I need to walk around, or a tree stump affords or calls out for me to sit on it, right? It affords the action of sitting. And so again, we know that in boredom, there is a lack of clear call outs for actions in that moment. There's a desire to be doing something, but nothing is satisfying that desire. There's nothing in the world that is affording our action in that moment. Finally, we can think about that intersection between self and world. We know that during an instance of boredom, people have this real sense of being cut off or disconnected from the world. There's a gap or a space between us and the world. And Andres El Perduro, put that very eloquently when he talks about the world when bored is not our world. It's not the world that's in line with our projects and our goals. And so this idea about the direction of attention during the feeling state of an emotion might be another important lens through which to think about the self-focused attention that is prominent during an episode of boredom. Emotion theory also highlights the fact that during a feeling state of emotion, our attention can have different modes. It can be operating in different ways. It can be operating in a more voluntary or involuntary way. It can be in a more detached or immersed kind of mode of being. So immersed is when our attention is really embedded in the activity. Detached is a more aloof, standing back sort of mode of attention. During an emotional episode, our attention can also have a more analytic or a more synthetic mode. So an analytic mode is when we are breaking something down into its component or constituent parts. And a synthetic mode is when we are taking in the whole and perceiving the coherent whole in the moment. And again, we could think about boredom in terms of modes of attention that are operating during an emotional episode. Boredom, our attention feels less voluntary when we're bored. We can't focus our attention the way we wish. Our attention is less immersed, and our attention is less synthetic. We're more seeing things in this analytic, kind of deconstructed manner. I think the findings that presented here today are also consistent with what we know from neuropsych findings regarding what's happening in the brain when we're bored. So we know that when we are bored, the default mode is more active. And this is the part of the brain that is thought to be responsible for experience of our interiority, our thoughts and feelings and sensations, as opposed to a focus on the external environment. We also know from neuropsych research that the insular cortex is implicated during an episode of boredom. And this makes sense in light of the present work because the insular cortex is thought to be responsible for our embodied experience of the here and now. It's also thought to be part of the salience network, which is involved in helping us shift our attention from an interior focus to an exterior focus. And in fact, some of the work of James Dankirk, for example, suggests that it may be that during an instance of boredom, the insular cortex is not able to effectively help us toggle between that internal and external focus. So the bored brain represents a brain that is stuck in this internal focus, but making this failed, futile attempt to focus more externally. So a few conclusions here before I go on to some future directions and implications of this. State boredom and state self-directed attention are conceptually and psychometrically distinct concepts. State boredom is a sufficient condition for state self-directed attention. Trait boredom, trait self-directed attention, and trait emotional awareness are conceptually and psychometrically distinct but correlated concepts. More specifically, trait self-directed attention and trait emotional awareness predict unique variants in boredom propensity. So in terms of some future directions, one of the first things I just want to suggest, I think it's going to be very important moving forward to further specify what we mean by self-directed attention during an instance of boredom or as a trait predisposition to becoming bored. So far, I've really just been talking about this idea, the fact that attention is focused on the self. And indeed, there's reason to think that just simply having attention focused on the self could be an important part of the boredom experience and help us understand why boredom is occurring, why people might get stuck in boredom. So for example, self-objectification theory and other research looking at disruption in skilled action all shows that when we represent the self from a third person perspective as this object in our perceptual field, that it disrupts performance. So that the self-objectification that happens during an instance of boredom may itself be enough to disrupt and disengage, participate in disengaging people from that fluid action. There's also an interesting theory called action identification theory that suggests that any action can be represented at different levels of abstraction. So, putting one's fingers around a glass, a cup, or lifting it to the mouth, at least it might be low-level descriptions of an action. But if you describe that same action at a higher level of quenching one's thirst or sharing a drink with friends, these are all different levels of representation of that action. And we know that when action is represented at a lower level of abstraction, that it's associated with disruptions in agency and difficulty engaging in those inactivities, or that when one is having difficulty engaging in an activity, that they shift to lower levels of action identification. So this might be another fruitful angle to explore and try to understand the role of self-focused attention in a boredom episode. However, going beyond the simple idea that attention is focused on the self, we could also explore why or in what manner attention is focused on the self. And this may be just as important than the fact that we are focusing on ourselves. And Trapnell and Campbell, in their famous critique or further elaboration of Fenigstein's work on self-conscious attention, they really bring this idea of motivation to the foreground. And they say, listen, people can focus attention on themselves for very different reasons. And unless we understand those reasons, we're going to miss an important part of the story. And so they make a distinction between a ruminative style and a reflective style. So a ruminative style refers to a situation when a person is in a more neurotic, anxious, uncertain, behaviorally inhibited way, focusing on the self to try to resolve uncertainty or to gain some clarity on the situation. And it's this ruminative motivation that is associated with problems. In contrast, a more epistemic curiosity or a kind of a reflective style might be a completely different beast when it comes to self-focused attention. We could also just think about, how the self is being construed or represented when it is the focus of attention. Is the self being construed in this more objective way as an empty bucket that needs filling? We heard earlier this morning about the sort of that desire to fill the self, or is the self being construed as a subjective source of meaning that is able to go out and make meaning in the world? Is the person engaged in a more reflective relationship with the self? So I think future work really needs to specify further what we mean by self-directed attention and its relationship to boredom. So in specifying self-directed attention, we can then start to explore different models and think about the relationship of self-directed attention and boredom. So as I've shown today, I believe that, when one is bored, they become more self-focused. And I think, how they handle that self-focused attention, or the manner in which that self-focused attention shows up, will either result in a capacity to exit boredom, perhaps if a person is engaged in a more self-reflective epistemic curiosity about the self. They might be able to exit boredom either through engaged self-reverie or daydreaming or nostalgia, which we spoke about earlier. Or if they engaged in this more ruminative, neurotic kind of self-directed attention, that might result in a protracted boredom, making it difficult to get out of their mind and back into engagement of some sort. And this, of course, may be particularly true if the individual lacks self-knowledge, if they're focused on themselves and yet they can't understand or articulate, they can't label, name, or describe what it is that they are experiencing in that moment. We can also look at some possible trait models. So it may be that trait self-directed attention is associated with propensity to be bored, as I've shown you today, because of this more ruminative, neurotic style of becoming preoccupied and stuck within the self. And indeed, some other work that I didn't present today suggests that this is really why trait self-directed attention is related to boredom propensity. And with respect to poor emotional awareness likely leads to an inability to articulate actionable desires, and an inability to articulate actionable desires is then going to go on to give rise to enhanced or increased boredom. And essentially, this is the psychoanalytic kind of model of what gives rise to, what causes boredom. And indeed, in the data that I've shown you earlier, poor emotional awareness is a very strong predictor of boredom propensity. So in conclusion, I would just say that the bored person focuses on but does not understand themselves. They're looking inward, perhaps in a ruminative, neurotic sort of way, but they can't label, they can't name, they can't describe their emotions. And it may be that understanding this constellation of self-focused attention and poor self-knowledge will help us better understand what's going on during an instance of boredom, and will help us understand why some people get stuck in boredom and others maybe can even use boredom as a time to self-reflect, and then armed with a new understanding of themselves, launch back into effective engagement with the world. So thank you for your attention and exploring some of these new ideas that we're just starting to think about in our lab. And I really welcome any comments or questions from you.
Yes, we have a first question.
Okay, thanks, John. We finished a bit early, so we have a number of questions, and looks like Reinhard wants to speak first.
Thank you so much, John. This really is intriguing. I would have a question about this lack of an action tendency or lack of a clear call out for action that you talked about. I could conceive this as a special case, but is this boredom more generally?
Reinhard, would you like to ask?
Oh, what's that?
Reinhard?
Hello? Yeah? Yes? Hello?
Reinhard, I can hear you just fine. I think perhaps the moderator is out of phase a
in
little
that
bit.
case, Rebecca, would you like to go?
Oh, you can hear me, John?
Yes, I can hear you, Reinhard.
Yes, we
Oh,
can.
okay,
Some of us
perfect.
are out of phase here.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. So this absence of an action tendency, is this a general feature of boredom, or is it a special case? So, for example, in our interviews with students, after having attended class, who talked about their boredom when being in class, they had any kinds of very concrete desires what to do instead of being in class, but they were just not allowed to leave, right? So they knew exactly, well, I would rather prefer doing some fun things out of school, but they couldn't. And therefore, they felt caught in the situation and felt bored. And that's another kind of case, right?
Yeah, well, thank you for your question. I think that's a great question. And first, let me just say that, I think there's lots of room for slightly different understandings about boredom or definitions of boredom. And I just want to acknowledge that to begin with. However, with respect to your question, what I would argue is that during an instance of boredom, the person doesn't want to do anything that is available in the moment. So sure, they can think about in the abstract, well, I'm sitting in this lecture and I don't like it and I'd rather be sailing. So they can think about things that they might like to do, but the point is that when bored, you can't want to do anything that's doable. And I see that, for me personally, that's a very important part of defining what it means to be bored. That when we are bored, we are caught in this bind of both desperately wanting something, but not wanting anything that's doable in that moment. And I think that this goes some way to helping us understand the fact that boredom is associated both with high and low arousal, and is associated with this feeling of being stuck, or the feeling of being kind of in a bind. So I didn't mean to suggest that when a person is bored, they can't imagine something that they might like to do, but that they can't want to do anything that is doable. Having said that, I'm certainly open to the idea that people can choose to define boredom in different ways, but this is the way that I'm currently thinking about boredom. And I'd be curious to see, Reinhard, if you think my response addresses your question or not.
Yes, absolutely. I fully agree with this refinement that you just proposed. We are exactly in the same boat. Yeah, that's a bit more specific as you put it now. That's great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Reinhard. Sorry, I'm having trouble with audio here. So Rebecca has their hand up next. And if not, I'll go to Marian's.
Oh, thank you, Professor Eastwood, for the presentation. This is the first time we have the opportunity to finally meet. Yeah, you're famous, and I'm at the beginning level of the career. And I have a question about your conceptualization of boredom, because you go with this cognitive approach, with the self-awareness things. And in your book, authored with Dunkert, you said that boredom is a feeling of thinking. So is it, are you meant that this is not emotion, or this is both emotion and more specifically perhaps a feeling of thinking? If you want to elaborate on this, because I'm not a psychologist, so this was.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think this is a great question that has come up already in earlier presentations, and would be a great thing for us to talk about and to discuss and to get different people's opinions on this. I think, again, I just want to preface my response by saying that I think there are a number of coherent ways of addressing this question. And I certainly think it is coherent to think about boredom as an emotion. I've chosen to not think about it as an emotion, but more specifically to think about it as a feeling. Now, in most component theories of emotion, a feeling is one component of an emotion. So emotion is a broader construct that involves a number of things: cognitive appraisal of the situation, physiological response, an action tendency, and a subjective feeling is one component of an emotion. But of course, we can have other kinds of feelings. We can feel hunger, but we wouldn't really say hunger is an emotion, right? We can feel physical pain, but we wouldn't say that that is an emotion. So then, what is feeling? Well, I think a feeling is a valence-toned subjective experience. And so I'm using the word feeling here in a very kind of global way to say that I'm choosing to situate my definition of boredom in the subjective experience, in the feeling state. And then we can go on and ask questions about what causes it or what contributes to it and what consequences flow from being bored. And I believe that the state of like when our mind is unoccupied and when we are caught in a desire bind, that those two subpersonal psychological processes give rise to the subjective feeling. So I would say the subjective feeling is just the feeling side, or what psychologists would call the personal level of that subpersonal psychological processes. And that's what I mean by saying that boredom is a feeling of a particular form of thinking. Namely, it's this form of thinking when the mind is unoccupied. And more recently, I've come to really see the importance of the desire bind component as well. So in my earlier work, I focused much more on the unengaged cognitive system. And in the book that you referred to, and more recently, I'm also now pairing that with this desire bind, which I think is another important component to fully appreciate the subjective feeling. So I think that boredom could be usefully and coherently thought of as an emotion. And if you do that, lots of interesting things follow. We need to now talk about appraisals. My feeling just is that boredom can be less focused on a specific triggering event than emotions typically are. And boredom, it can be more free floating than an emotion typically is, and that might put it in the realm of a mood, for example, or a feeling. And I also think that boredom can be a little more long-lasting than emotions typically are. And so for various reasons, I've chosen to think about it as a feeling more specifically than an emotion proper. So I don't know if that sort of addresses your question, but those are a few of my thoughts on it.
Yes, perfectly.
Yes,
Now,
perfectly. Okay, great. We have 12 or 13 minutes left, and I know Rebecca wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry about that.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Sorry, are you getting an echo?
Are you getting an echo?
It's okay.
Okay. I was wondering if you could speak a little more about the sense of self that's required for that kind of self-directed attention. Because obviously, coming from the animal world, we talk about whether animals have different levels of awareness and whether they have sort of metacognitive abilities, but I was wondering if we know anything from people with dementia, for example, about whether you really need a coherent sense of self in order to have those experiences.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And this is, you know, as I've said, a very new area for us that we're starting to explore. And I certainly don't know of any research that looks at self-awareness or self-focused attention in people with dementia, for example. But let me speak to your question about what kind of self is required. And you kind of alluded to a well-known distinction in the consciousness literature between what's often referred to as first order and second order consciousness. So first order consciousness is when a person is having a phenomenal experience, but in second order consciousness, there's now a reflexive turn where the person's phenomenal awareness becomes the object of their phenomenal awareness, right? So they now are reflecting on themselves as the source of that experience that they're having. And, you know, when I started thinking about this initially, I was wondering whether it might be helpful to think about boredom as being inherently this second order state. But I sort of fairly quickly moved away from that way of thinking, because I think in first order consciousness, you can, as I said, shift the pole of your attention to the self, to the world, to action in a feeling state. And so I think it's possible to be focused on the self while still in a first order consciousness state. In fact, there is some research showing that, I'm not sure if I call it empirical research or theory, but work suggesting that people who are alexithymic, so people who struggle to name, label, describe their emotions, so this would be the emotional awareness construct in my talk, people who have that quality lack second order awareness, that they're stuck in a kind of a first order consciousness. There's also some work suggesting, I would argue, that if people are able to shift to a second order awareness, that might provide a reflexive position from which it's possible to exit the boredom episode. So in answer to your question, I would say that I don't believe you have to have a second order awareness or that sense of self to experience the phenomenal experience of boredom. I do believe that for humans who do have that capacity, that second order awareness, that it might be interesting to think about ways in which second order awareness can help someone exit an episode of boredom. But these are fascinating questions, and I think they start to really, we need to look to our philosopher friends as well to help us out in this regard. There's a lot of fascinating ideas here to explore.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So I think we have 8 or 9 minutes left. I think it was Vinan next, and then Andreas.
Yeah, thanks, John, for a fascinating talk. It's really exciting to see this new line of research. And I have a question about what you use as self-focused attention. So it got me thinking. You know, one of the features of people who are easily bored is that they seem to be easily distractible or disengaged with their current situation. And you know, there's always this joke that sometimes there's a dog that pays attention to you and then it sees a squirrel and runs off or something like that. And in context of something like boredom, when you talk about self-focused attention, does it mean that attention is rigidly focused on the self, or is it that in the absence of external stimuli, it kind of focuses on the self, but as soon as something distractible comes up, it rapidly shifts or something like that? I don't know if my question makes sense. So this distinction between the flexibility of attention and the preoccupation of attention.
Yes, that's a good question, and you know, and this is all kind of on the leading edge of my thinking, and so I don't have a definitive answer, but let me just say a few things. So when I talked about the poles of attention, right, I think that during boredom, attention is focused on the self predominantly as a pole. When I talked about modes of attention, I think the mode of attention is more detached and therefore, not immersed in that self-focus and perhaps therefore more distractible. When I was thinking about why someone who is self-focused might get stuck in a boredom state and might persist in boredom, either because of some trait factor or what's happening in a moment of boredom. In those moments, I think I was implicitly, but not until you mentioned it, was I aware of it. I think I was implicitly thinking about it as a more preoccupied focus on the self. And I think that what happens, what I'm proposing here is that when bored, the self becomes very salient and very problematic and becomes then the focus of attention. And because it's that focus of attention, I think it interferes with successful kind of engagement in activity. So I think your question alerts me to the need to be a little more precise about this. And I think that certainly when bored, I think we're in a detached mode, but I think there is a preoccupation with the self pole in terms of what it is that we're focused on.
Okay, thank you. And Andreas?
Thanks, John, for a fantastic talk. This is a bit inchoate, so I apologize for not having quite thought both through this. I really like the description of boredom as a desire bind, and that makes a lot of sense just from first personal perspective. I wonder if these findings right now complicate the picture even further and add an additional kind of bind. So it seems that knowing yourself is key in alleviating boredom. And I mean that quite broadly construed, knowing my emotional states, knowing the things that I like. But at the same time, it seems that I need to be thrown back to myself to know what I'm experiencing, the things that I like, what I want to do further. But perhaps this self-directed attention might be the cause of boredom. Have you had any thoughts? Is this another difficulty? Is this why boredom is so hard to get out of it? Maybe it's not just that we don't know what we're going to do or we want to do, but maybe in order to figure that out, we need to go through boredom and kind of expose ourselves to that. This was all caused by that mentioning that might be a sufficient condition of boredom. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you. It's a great question. And indeed, I mean, this is one of the things that interests me about this line of thinking, because I think it does there is another complexity here that needs to be unpacked or explored. And there is another possible bind. My current thinking is that the bind is resolved when you explore two ideas, right? The first idea is this: how or in what manner attention is focused on the self. So we need to think beyond simply that you are thinking about yourself, but in what manner or in what mode you are thinking about yourself. And I think the mode or the manner, to use vague, broad terms, makes all the difference in the world as to whether or not a person is going to persist and get stuck in the bored state, or whether or not they will find the way out, the way out of it. The second idea in my current thinking that helps us undo this bind or resolve the bind is this concept of first order and second order consciousness. And so I think that I think the proposal that I'm wanting to explore is the idea that when we shift to a self-reflexive state, that in a self-reflexive state, that the self is not problematic in the same way. It's not experienced in that same preoccupying problematic state. The self now becomes this object of epistemic curiosity. It becomes something that we can then look at. And by looking at yourself having an experience, what it does in some of the clinical work on self-reflexivity shows that self-reflexivity engenders agency. And so, I'm very interested in the concept of agency as it pertains to boredom. So we know from the clinical literature that when people are self-focused but not reflexive, that's associated with all kinds of mental health problems. But the reflexive turn to that meta conscious state, or that second order awareness, just that turn has the effect of creating agency. And I think that then it becomes possible to exit the boredom state with greater self-understanding. So admittedly, my ideas here are still underdeveloped, but that's kind of the direction I would go to resolve the complexity or the bind that you accurately identified there.
Okay, thanks. We have a minute or two. John, I don't know whether you wanted to address the comment by Lizzie Burns in the chat function here. She's asking about poetry and different artistic practices of a non-Western derivation that are less kind of self-absorbed or kind of pathologically narcissistic than apparently some of ours are. Wondering whether you had a quick comment about that. You're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting comment. I'm just opening up the chat so I can look at it and think about this. Yeah, I think I mentioned when Manuel was speaking earlier this morning on his work about consumption, being empty or being overwhelmed with stuff. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And I think in our modern culture, there's been a turn towards having an objectified understanding of the self. And I think once we view ourselves in this objectified way, we can then be full or empty. And I think that we then are also no longer agents. We're no longer sources of subjective meaning making. And so I think our modern culture, our technologically advanced culture sees human beings in this more objectified ways. And I think we've inherited that way of viewing ourselves. And in fact, I'm getting a little bit off topic, but, I think boring situations essentially objectify us, right? So when in a boring situation, we become fungible, right? So what's experienced at that moment is generic. You could take John out of the picture and put anyone else in the picture, and the same thing would be experienced. There's no room for me to bring forth a particular meaning in that moment, right? So my subjectivity has been denied in that boring moment. And so I think, in our Western culture, there likely has been this shift towards this more objectified self, which may be associated with increased boredom. But of course, here I'm wildly speculating and outside of my area of expertise, so I need to be cautious. As it relates to literature, I'm not sure I have anything specific to say, but certainly I think there is a cultural background in Eastern and Western approaches to the self that is no doubt going to be relevant here in an area that's ripe for future consideration.